A single crack of the shakot could silence a crowd. In the age of Africa's colonial conquest, this whip, cut from sun-dried hippopotamus hide, left hundreds of thousands marked with scars as visible proof of control. But the shakot was only the beginning. Behind closed conference doors in 1885, European diplomats devised a legal framework they claimed brought civilization, while secretly embracing a system built on terror. How did bureaucratic paperwork lead to mutilations so systematic that a child's hand became just another ledger entry? The truth behind the most horrifying punishment methods used in colonized Africa begins with the sound that haunted a continent and leads deeper than you might imagine. In February 1885, diplomats from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin to divide Africa with the stroke of a pen. The General Act of the Berlin Conference promised to end slavery and spread Christianity, but the real machinery of control was buried in the fine print. The continent was parceled out with little regard for the millions already living there. In the vast Congo, for example, fewer than 1,000 Europeans were expected to govern a territory twice the size of France. Otto von Bismarck and Lord Granville, among others, knew their empires lacked the manpower to police every village or forest. Telegrams between delegates reveal a blunt calculation. Visible public punishment would enforce order where soldiers could not. Colonial authorities turned to local intermediaries, arming them with the authority to discipline entire populations. The idea was simple: make a single example so brutal that the memory would ripple through thousands. The General Act's language about moral effect and pacification masked a doctrine of deterrence. Punishment was not just a response to disobedience, it became a spectacle, a warning, designed to echo across the land. This was the legal blueprint for a system where terror replaced law, and pain became a tool of governance. Bureaucratic paperwork laid the groundwork for a world where violence was not an accident, but a policy. One that would soon be measured in severed limbs and scarred flesh. In the Congo Free State, paperwork became a weapon. Each force publique soldier received a fixed number of cartridges and faced strict accounting. For every bullet spent, a severed right hand had to be delivered as proof. This was not a rumor but a documented procedure, confirmed by missionary reports, colonial ledgers, and the 1904 Casement Inquiry. The logic was chillingly simple. Ammunition was expensive and imported from Europe, so every shot had to be justified. Hands, sometimes still warm, were stacked in baskets and counted by clerks in district outposts. The hands did not always come from the dead. When soldiers missed their targets or wasted bullets hunting, they still needed to balance their ledgers. Testimonies from the era, including those gathered by Roger Casement and Alice Seeley Harris, describe how children and the elderly were mutilated simply to satisfy the quota. In one account, 81 hands were seen being smoked over a fire to preserve them for inspection. The system quickly corrupted itself. Hands became a kind of currency, traded to fill quotas or shorten military service. Villages raided neighbors to collect more hands, and concession companies paid bonuses for higher tallies. Photographs taken by missionaries, stark clinical images, captured children with stumps where hands had been, their wounds still raw. These images, circulated in Europe, forced the world to confront the reality behind the numbers. In the ledgers, a hand was just a tally mark. In the villages, it was a lifetime of loss, a policy written directly onto the body. Agents of the rubber concession companies arrived in villages with a new kind of threat. Instead of punishing Tien, who failed to meet the rubber quota directly, they took the people the men loved most. Wives and children were rounded up and marched to makeshift stockades, often nothing more than a pen of sharpened stakes or barbed wire. Missionaries traveling through Equateur and Bandinda recorded dozens of women and children huddled together behind these barriers, their names entered in ledgers alongside the quotas their husbands owed. The demand was precise: 4 kilograms of wild rubber every 2 weeks. If a man returned empty-handed, his family would go without food, or worse, face beatings from the guards. Some died of starvation in the stockades, their bodies listed as lost collateral in company paperwork. Company agents kept careful records, noting each hostage and the amount of rubber delivered. Local chiefs, powerless to intervene, sometimes watched as entire families disappeared into the custody of foreign overseers. Oral histories from the Bolia and neighboring peoples describe the terror of these abductions. Children snatched from doorways, mothers dragged away in the night, the silence of the village broken only by the wails from the stockade. The threat was clear: the labor of one man now held the fate of his entire family. In this system, violence reached far beyond the body. It became a weapon against the very bonds that held communities together. On the barren outcrop of Shark Island, just off the coast of Lüderitz, the wind carried more than salt and sand. Survivors remembered the endless rows of tents, the stench of sickness, and the daily toll of bodies carried away at dawn. After the Herero and Nama uprisings in 1904, German colonial authorities herded thousands of men, women, and children onto this patch of rock. Within a year, more than 4 out of every 5 prisoners would die. Exposure, starvation, and disease claimed nearly 80% of those interned. But the dead did not remain at rest. German officers, following orders from Berlin, set aside the bodies for a chilling purpose. Prisoners were forced to scrape the flesh from the skulls of their own relatives, using shards of broken glass or dull knives. Testimonies from Nama descendants recall the horror of this work, hands trembling as they prepared remains for shipment. Shipping manifests logged at least 1,200 skulls packed in crates, labeled as scientific specimens, and sent to German universities. Felix von Luschan, a prominent anthropologist in Berlin, signed for dozens of these deliveries. In anatomy halls, Herero and Nama skulls became objects of study, fueling racist theories that would echo through the next century. The camp's ledgers recorded names and numbers, but the true cost was measured in memory: families broken, ancestors displayed behind glass, and a wound that still runs through Namibian history. Across French West Africa, the sound of iron on bone became a daily fact of life for those who fell behind on the hut tax. Colonial magistrates, backed by the authority of the French state, issued judgments that transformed unpaid taxes into sentences of hard labor. Court dockets from 1913, preserved in A Nom J series, list thousands of names, each one a man condemned not by a crime, but by poverty. In Senegal alone that year saw 2,500 men shackled together by the neck with heavy iron collars, forming human chains that snaked from the courthouse steps to the edge of the bush. The journey did not end there. These forced laborers were marched to the sites of colonial ambition: railbeds, road cuts, and river docks. The Dakar-Niger Railway, begun in the early 19-teens, rose on the backs of these prisoners, their sweat and blood binding the gravel and steel. Overseers kept strict ledgers, tracking each man's output and each day lost to exhaustion or escape. Chain gangs worked from dawn until dusk, their collars rubbing skin raw, their ankles swollen from iron fetters. Labor became a sentence, and the colonial judiciary a recruiting agency for the infrastructure that would tie the continent to European markets. Oral histories from villages along the old rail lines recall the clank of chains and the silence that followed when a neighbor did not return. In the records, these men are listed as labor convicts. In memory, they are the foundation stones of empire. In Portuguese-controlled Angola and Mozambique, the palmatoria became a fixture of colonial discipline. This device, nothing more than a flat wooden paddle drilled with 5 circular holes, was wielded by police and overseers, against anyone accused of disrespect or minor defiance. The holes were not decorative. When the paddle struck an open palm, air rushed through the gaps and created a vacuum that pulled flesh into each cavity. The result was more than pain. The skin would swell and blister, blood vessels would rupture beneath the surface, and the hand would often balloon until the fingers could no longer move. Colonial medical notes from the 1920s describe hands so badly bruised that victims could not work or even feed themselves for weeks. The Lisbon Military Museum preserves one such paddle, its edges worn smooth from repeated use. In disciplinary manuals, the palmatoria was listed as punishment for everything from talking back to failing to salute. Victims, often labeled insolent or uncooperative, were left functionally disabled, a warning to others about the cost of even the smallest challenge to colonial order. The tool's simplicity masked the precision of its cruelty, a calculated way to disable without killing, to turn a hand into a mark of obedience. In 1924, the French Parliament codified a system that placed colonial administrators above the law. The Code de l'Indigénat, already operating in practice since the late 19th century, now spelled out in black and white the powers of every official, from the district chief to the rural gendarme. With the stroke of a pen, more than 30 vague offenses, such as insulting an official, hindering traffic, and failing to salute the flag, became grounds for instant punishment. No trial, no defense, no appeal. Article 7 of the Code laid out the most infamous sanction. Up to 25 lashes could be delivered on the spot, with the number set at the administrator's discretion. Parliamentary debates from that year show lawmakers openly discussing the need to maintain order in the colonies, with little mention of due process. Enforcement memos, sent from Paris to Dakar and Brazzaville, clarified that records of such punishments were to be kept, but they were rarely reviewed. Between 1924 and the Code's abolition in 1946, over 1 million summary punishments were recorded across French Africa. The law itself became a weapon, granting impunity to those who wielded it and turning the colonial officer into judge, jury, and executioner. For the millions living under its shadow, the lash was no longer just a tool of pain, it was the signature of a system that legalized cruelty as an everyday fact of life. In the Libyan desert, Italian officers devised a punishment that left no visible wounds, but broke the will of those who resisted. Senussi captives were buried upright in the sand, exposed to the relentless Saharan sun, with only their heads above ground. Water was withheld. Reports preserved in the ASMIE files and accounts from missionaries stationed near Kufra indicate death usually came within 2 to 3 days, sometimes less, as heat and dehydration took hold. General Graziani's internal memos, recovered decades later, describe this method as a tool for psychological effect against rebel leaders. The intent was not just to kill, but to create a spectacle of helplessness. Local oral histories recall the silence that settled over the dunes, broken only by the cries of those left to die. Italian patrols sometimes returned after 2 days to find nothing but a skull and a patch of disturbed sand. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be met not only with violence, but with a slow, public erasure. In these moments, terror was wielded as a warning, its true power lying in the fear it planted among those still free. Inside the detention camps of British Kenya in the 1950s, the violence of empire took on a new, secretive form. Security officers were tasked with breaking the Mau Mau rebellion by any means necessary. Medical records later uncovered in the British National Archives document over 20,000 cases of severe injury among detainees, evidence of a system built on invasive torture. Interrogators used pliers, designed for castration, and forced heated eggs or glass bottles into the rectums of suspects to extract confessions for intelligence files. Survivors described these assaults as punishments that left lasting physical and psychological scars, often resulting in incontinence sexual dysfunction, and chronic pain. Official paperwork rarely mentioned torture. Clerks logged vague notes about medical attention required, or disciplinary measures administered, masking the true nature of what happened behind barbed wire. Brutality. As international scrutiny grew, colonial administrators moved to erase the evidence. In 1957, the Foreign Office issued a directive called Operation Legacy, ordering the systematic destruction of files that detailed torture and abuse in Kenyan camps. Clerks gathered reports, medical logs, and interrogation records into burn bags. Whole archives vanished in bonfires or were shipped back to London for shredding, leaving only scattered references in surviving correspondence. The aim was to ensure that should independence arrive, the new Kenyan government would inherit no written proof of the crimes committed. What remains today are fragments, a handful of medical reports, survivor depositions, and the testimony of doctors who treated injuries too severe to ignore. The story of the egg torture survives not because it was meant to, but because some records escaped the flames, and because those who endured it could not forget. Erasure. On March 3, 1959, the gates of Hola Camp in Kenya closed on 83 detainees who had been ordered to dig irrigation ditches. When they refused, guards armed with clubs and metal rods descended. Within minutes, 11 men lay dead on the ground. Official reports claimed they had died from drinking contaminated water. That story was repeated in telegrams to Nairobi and in statements sent to London. The bodies were buried quickly, but questions lingered. Families demanded answers, and whispers of violence traveled beyond the camp's wire. A coroner's inquest opened in Mombasa the following month. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Autopsy reports preserved in Colonial Office File CO82222089 documented fractured skulls, crushed ribs, and deep lacerations. Dr. H.C.B. Lukes, tasked with examining the dead, found no signs of water intoxication, only blunt force trauma. One victim's skull was broken in 3 places. Another's brain showed signs of hemorrhage, not drowning. Survivor affidavits described men being beaten until brains spilled out. The cover-up unraveled as these findings reached the press. The Guardian published the coroner's verdict in April 1959, finding that the men died from beatings, not water. Parliament debated the incident, with members of Parliament reading from the inquest transcripts and demanding accountability. The Colonial Secretary, Alan Lennox Boyd, tried to defend the administration, but the evidence was overwhelming. Headlines in British newspapers called Hola a British Belsen. Public faith in the empire cracked. Polls showed a majority of Britons now favored Kenyan independence. The events at Hola Camp, once hidden behind official denials, became the undeniable proof that colonial rule could no longer be justified. The story of 11 men, killed for refusing to dig, forced a reckoning that echoed far beyond the camp's barbed wire. Long after the scars fade, colonial punishment lingers in laws, institutions, and internalized shame. Across Africa, legal codes and policing methods still echo these systems, outlawed but not erased. The past is not distant. As governments debate reparations and apology, the legacy of sanctioned cruelty shapes identity and justice today. History's wounds demand reckoning, not silence. What would true accountability look like? Share your thoughts below.